Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a book haul revisit for the month of August. If you're unfamiliar, this is where I look back at past book hauls from the month of August to try to see how many of the books that I spent money on and brought into my library I have read, how many I would still like to read, how many I got rid of, and start the process of thinking about whether or not there are any books in here that I might want to get rid of in the future. It's my way of holding myself accountable for the way I spend money on books. And during the process of doing book haul revisits, I have learned a lot about myself as a reader. For instance, I have learned that I'm more likely to read a nonfiction book by listening to the audiobook than I am to read the print book. So I have hopefully made a bit of an adjustment and thinking about how I purchase nonfiction books and whether or not it's something that I would like to have in my library, or if it's something that I will just listen to on audio and maybe don't necessarily need to have in the library. It's all about spending money smartly, hopefully, because I enjoy spending money on books, but want to do so responsibly and try to just have the best library possible. Because we are going to be looking at 5 years of book hauls, I have made some adjustments to help for time. So I am not going to spend any time talking about what these books are about. I will have links to the original book haul video in the description box down below. If you want more information about a particular book, I would encourage you to check out the original book haul video. There will also be more books than you see here in those original book haul videos. And the reason for that is, again, to save time. So in cases where I was purchasing copies of a book because I wanted to have all of that author's books, Sue Grafton, Louise Erdrich, Toni Morrison, situations like that, I have not included them here. I have not included any books that I purchased as part of my Pulitzer Prize project, because along the way in that project where I'm reading all of the books that have won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, I started collecting hardcovers of those, but that's for a very different purpose. So the only books I'm really considering here are books that I spent my own money on, hoping to read in the near future or at some point. There are some library builders in here, but that books that have that intention are what is included here. I also have not included anything that was gifted to me, whether by a friend or from a publisher. And just really quickly to illustrate some of the things that didn't make it, I want to give a special shout out to 4 books that were hauled in the month of August, but which don't qualify for our purposes here today. The first is Hamnet, because when Hamnet was released in the United States, I had already read it. I was given access to an e-galley through NetGalley, but I loved it so much that I pre-ordered a copy of the book from Montana Book Company. So it wasn't purchased for the reason that these other books were. For that reason, it doesn't really qualify, but it was a great book and I read it and I want to shout it out. Temple Folk by Alia Bilal was actually sent to me by Alia Bilal last year in exchange for a review, and that was before it was nominated for the National Book Award. So she sent me a signed copy of her book, and because it wasn't something that I had spent money on, it doesn't qualify for our purposes. But by the way, great book, and it would be well worth your time. I was sent an advanced reader's copy of Absolution by Alice McDermott from FSG last year, so it doesn't qualify, but it's a great book. And I did end up purchasing a copy of Let Us Descend by Jessamine Ward, but I actually won, or Joel won, a advanced reader's copy of it on Instagram. So that is how I got it. So by the time I purchased a copy, I had already read it. So it kind of doubly doesn't count for our purposes today. But let's get going into the actual book haul revisit. Again, we have 5 years to look at, and we are going to go back in time as we move. So we're going to start with the most recent book haul, and we'll end with the oldest, the one that's a little bit further away. So let's get going on that. The August 2023 book haul has 5 books that qualify for it, and you can right away see the influence of Alice McDermott having a new book last year, because I was in my local used bookstore and saw a copy of At Weddings and Wakes, which had been a previous book by Alice McDermott, which had been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, I believe. So I grabbed it, and I have not read it yet, but I didn't really intend to get to it right away. And also, I think it was in the sales section of my local used bookstore, so it was maybe $2. So I didn't spend a lot of money on it. I don't feel bad letting it sit a little bit. The intention was to read Absolution last year because that was the one that is coming out or was coming out at the time. So I don't know when I will get to At Weddings and Wakes. It's not a very long book. It's just barely over 200 pages. So I have not gotten to it yet. I'm totally fine letting it hang out in my library, and I'll get to it at some point. Now, we have our first success story that qualified for the book haul revisit, Hello Beautiful by Anne Napolitano. At this time last year, Danny, who is that bookish bear on Instagram, had told me that I needed to read this book. And I finally did in January, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite reads of 2024 so far. I will link that video in the description box down below if you'd like to hear more about what I thought of this book. It's just wonderful. So I did read this book. I loved it, and it's not going anywhere because I loved it, and I'm so happy having it on my shelves. Around this time last year, I read Tom Lake by Ann Patchett, and I loved it. So it renewed interest in going back and reading some of her older books. The only one I had read was Run, and I really didn't like that book, so I stayed away from Ann Patchett for a very long time. Tom Lake is the book that brought me back into the fold, and I liked it enough that I wanted to read more. I saw a copy of Commonwealth in hardcover for cheap and decided I had to grab it because Commonwealth is one of her books that is most often recommended to me. Bel Canto is another one. The Dutch House is another one. But I do feel like I'm a little split now. Commonwealth did feel like the one that I would be most likely to read next. But now I'm thinking I probably need to catch up to Bel Canto, which was on the New York Times 100 Best Books of the 21st Century so far. So I don't know which one I will get to next. I have not read Commonwealth yet, as you can gather from that. But Ann Patchett is an author that I'm really looking to explore further and more deeply. And for that reason, Commonwealth is not going anywhere. And kind of by accident, I've been collecting her books in hardcover. So now I feel like anytime I get one of her books, I need to make sure it's a hardcover. That way they'll all kind of match. So I haven't read it yet, but I still want to. Then, The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver. Again, flashback to last year. I had loved Demon Copperhead. It was my favorite book of 2022, I believe. And then it went on to win the Pulitzer. It went on to win the Women's Prize. And it renewed some interest in reading other books by Barbara Kingsolver that I hadn't gotten around to. The Lacuna is probably her most loved book that I hadn't gotten to. So I have not read it yet. This is kind of a library builder, and you could kind of put it in that camp of Toni Morrison books or Louise Erdrich books. However, I'm not collecting the entire set of Barbara Kingsolver books. I don't know that I want to go all in on reading every single book that she has read at some point in the future, but I do want to read The Lacuna. So for that reason, I'm including it in this book haul, and even though it is a library builder, I had no immediate plans to get to it, and I still don't have immediate plans to get to it. But at some point in the future, I will be hopefully getting to The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver. And then I saw a copy of A Lesson Before Dying by Ernest Gaines at my local used bookstore and grabbed it just because this is a book I consistently hear really good things about. So I have not read it, but this was a library builder. I didn't have immediate plans to get to it. And that's sort of the theme of my 2023 book haul, where it feels like a lot of the books that I spent money on were things that I had ambition to get to at some point in the future. I think the only one that really doesn't fit that was Hello Beautiful by Anne Napolitano. And I did actually get to that one. In fact, it's the only book in August of 2023 that I brought into my library and have read. So you can right away see the difference. There was more of a sense of immediacy about bringing this book into my library and reading it than there was about any of the others. So it's probably not surprising that I've only read one and that it was Hello Beautiful by Anne Napolitano. And it's probably not surprising since it's only been a year, but I have not unhauled any of the books that qualified for our purposes in this book haul revisit today. I don't even think I've unhauled anything that would have been in the full book haul, but don't quote me on that. So 1 out of 5, according to Google, is about 20%. So I'm standing at about a 20% success rate. However, I still really want to read a lot of these books. So the numbers are helpful, but aren't in the entire story. So I think I did a good job curating a list of books for my library that I would like to get to at some point in the future. Again, library builders. So I don't really feel bad about that. And then unhauling 0 books is pretty good as well, because I think it shows that there isn't even a question mark on any of these books. I would hold on to all of them. So I think I did a pretty good job with my book haul last year. Let's go back to August of 2022, which was a very unique case because at the time I did that book haul, I had read 3 out of the 4 books that I hauled, and since then I've read all of them. However, one of them didn't qualify. It was Less by Andrew Sean Greer, because that was purchased for my Pulitzer Prize collection, so it doesn't qualify for our purposes, but it was in there. However, there's a 100% success rate with the books that I read, because even in the 3 that qualify for our purposes, I've read all of them. First was The Queens of Sarmiento Park by Camila, Sosa, Villada. This was for the LGBTQ plus in translation read along that I was doing that year with Jen the Librarian. And in the United States, this was translated as a book called Bad Girls, but I really didn't like the cover and I liked this title better, so I ordered this from the UK. So just want to note that right now, because if you look for this right now, you will only find this as something that is available in the UK, but if you look in the United States, you would have to look for the title Bad Girls. So I did read it for that project and enjoyed it. So it's really not going to be going anywhere. Then there was The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. This was a fun project because this was on a list of summer reading titles for my niece, who used to be a big reader, but has not been that much of a reader lately. So we did a sort of buddy read with my sister and with my niece, where we all read this book and chatted about it. And I actually really liked this. I had not seen the movie, the animated film adaptation, since I was a kid, and it scared me. But I rewatched it after I read the book, and I loved this book. So that is another success story. And then there was Night Crawling by Layla Motley. I believe this was the one book that I had not read yet when I did my book haul for August of 2022, but I read it, I believe, the following month. Possibly because at the time it was longlisted for the Booker Prize, I believe. But I really had wanted to read it anyway, and there was a sense of urgency. And also, part of me really liked the novelty of being able to say that I had read every book that I hauled in the month of August. So I was destined to read it, and I liked it. I will say, I have thought about whether or not it's something I need to keep permanently in my library, because I don't know that I would ever revisit it. But I don't really need space at the location of my library where this is. I actually really don't need space anywhere in my library right now all that badly. So perhaps someday, if I'm crunched for space and need to make some tough decisions, I might get rid of Night Crawling. But right now, I'm very comfortable leaving it in my library because I did like it. And, you know, enough that I would hold on to it, but if I ever need space, I might think a little bit differently. So I already spoiled the reading results from my August of 2022 book haul. 100%. I read 3 out of the 3 books that qualified, and there was only one additional book in that book haul, and it's still 100% if you add that book into the mix. And I haven't unhauled anything. Again, I think I'm going to end up keeping all of them. The only one that potentially has a question mark is Night Crawling. And not because I didn't like the book, it's just that I don't think I would revisit it at any point in the future, if that makes sense. So if I ever have a really big crunch for space, I might think about unhauling Night Crawling. But for now, it's going to stick around, and I don't have any plans to get rid of it. Now we get to August of 2021. The first book that I brought into my library was Damnation Spring by Ash Davidson. I did read this book and I liked it, not enough to hold onto it. So I sort of released it into the wild and traded it in for credit at my local used bookstore. But I did like it. I was on a whole journey with this book. I had started it and then put it down temporarily and then got back to it and did finish it. But we don't need to get into those details here because, again, I'm trying to keep this from being a longer video, so we won't get into it. But I did read it. That's the good news. And again, I liked it, just not enough to hold in my library, especially since at the time I did have a big crunch for space. So I had to make some tough decisions, and I decided that Damnation Spring was not a book that I needed to hold on to. And then there was Once There Were Wolves by Charlotte McConaughey. This, I think, was the last year that I was a member of the Book of the Month Club, and I got both Damnation Spring and Once There Were Wolves from Book of the Month. And the fact that there were so many books that I got from them that were just sitting in my library unread is one of the reasons I'm not a member anymore. I totally understand there are a lot of people who love it, but I found in my book haul revisits that a lot of the books that I was bringing in through Book of the Month were the ones that I was not getting to and most likely to end up unhauling. So for me, it didn't really make sense to continue. And Once There Were Wolves is sort of a perfect case in point because I never ended up reading it. And the feedback I got on it was very mixed. And I believe there is an audio on Scribd or whatever Scribd is called these days. So I figured I could release it. And if I ever do want to read it, I'll have access to the audio. But I think it's telling that even with the audio saved in my list, I haven't gotten around to it. And that's kind of the way it is. Then we get to the ones that I still have in my library. First is After Parties by Anthony Viazna. So, and because I just slandered Book of the Month Club a little bit, I should point out that this is a bit of a success story from there, even though I haven't read it, because I still want to read this book and I will hold on to it until I finally get around to reading it. I have heard good things about this one. I don't know when I will get to it, but I would like to at some point. And again, the fact that people still, even this year, at least one person has mentioned to me that they think I would like After Parties. So it keeps the sense of urgency alive that I will eventually get to it. And I'm kind of thinking that maybe next year or later this year, I might try to spend more time with short story collections because I love short story collections. And I know a lot of people struggle with them, but I am a fan and I haven't really spent a whole lot of time with them in recent years. So maybe next year or later this year, I'll do a bit of a side project where I try to spend more time with them. And that would make this a good case in point for that because it's something that I would like to get to at some point. Then the first volume of Heartstopper was brought into my library, and I have read all of the Heartstopper books that have been published at this point. I had 2 of them that I had not read, but I got to them in the month of June. So I'm all caught up on these. They're adorable. I have the whole set. You can kind of see my graphic novel collection is on this shelf right there, and Heartstopper would be right about in the middle. So I have read this. It's a success story, and the collection is going to stay on my shelves and not go anywhere. So, in August of 2021, I read 2 out of the 4 books that I brought into my library that qualify for our purposes. And that is, without even Googling it, I can tell you that's a 50% success rate. I can do math that much. And in terms of unhaul, I've gotten rid of 2 of the books. So again, we're standing at 50%. But I did read one of those books that I unhauled before I did. I unhauled it pretty much because I decided I didn't love it enough to keep it in my library. Let's move on to August of 2020. The first 2 books had been put on my reading list because of the Booker Prize, and I'm going to lump them together because of that. There's Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga and This Mournable Body by Tsitsi Dangarembga. And This Mournable Body had been longlisted for the Booker Prize. I can't remember if it ended up making the shortlist. I think it did. I didn't check before I started filming, and I'm not going to stop right now. But I know it was on the long list because when I saw it on the list, it immediately jumped out to me as a book that I wanted to read. And because it was the 3rd book, I got it in my head that I should start with Nervous Conditions, which is the opening of the trilogy. And as soon as I ordered them or brought them into my library, I started hearing very mixed things because people actually started reading their way through the long list of the Booker Prize, and This Mournable Body had very mixed results. And then I also started hearing some very mixed things about Nervous Conditions, which was the original. So I decided, well, at some point, maybe I'll try them for myself. And then in the years since 2020, the likelihood that I would ever get around to them started to drop. And at a certain point, I acknowledged, honestly, I don't know how likely I am to read these books anymore. The urgency is pretty much dead at this point. And with it, I don't know if there will be another book in the series or anything like that, but I just feel like I was okay letting it go. So I got rid of both of them without having read them. What I should mention as well is that I think I was on a high with the Booker Prize in 2020 because there was a book that had been longlisted for the Booker in 2019 that immediately jumped out to me, and I ordered a copy and I read it and I loved it. And we're going to talk about that one when we get back to the August of 2019 book haul. But the reason I allowed myself to go all in on Nervous Conditions in This Mournable Body was because of the success that I had in August of 2019 with a book that stood out to me from the long list of the Booker Prize. That magic didn't really repeat, ultimately, unfortunately. And you can sort of see there are other Booker books that have popped up in the years since, but not in the same way. Then there was The Yield by Tara June Winch, which it feels like everybody on BookTube, or at least in my corner of BookTube, was talking about in 2020. I got this copy of it and did it as a buddy read with Sean Breathe's books, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite reads of 2020. It's a great book. I actually have it faced out on my bookshelf, but you can't see it because we can sort of wrap around the corner a little bit, and it's right over there where you can't see it, and it's also on the bottom shelf. So even if it was a shelf that you could see, it would be down on the bottom, so you wouldn't see it. But it's a book that I love, and it's a really gorgeous cover as well, so I love seeing it faced out on my shelf. And for that reason, you can imagine that it is not going to be going anywhere. I plan to keep The Yield, and it will hopefully live in my library as long as I'm around, at least. Then we have Filthy Beasts by Kirkland Hamill. This was recommended to me by a bookseller at the time, and I looked into it. It did seem like a very me book, so I purchased it. I admit there's never really been very high interest to read this book, or very high urgency to read this book, and now we're 4 years out and I haven't. So I have considered several times this year, do I need to keep this book? I really don't know. I am holding on to it mostly because I don't really need the space. This lives in the nonfiction section back here, and we'll see what happens. I'm not going to get rid of it right now, but in another year or two, if I have not gotten around to this, I don't really see much point in keeping it. It does still sound interesting. I think part of it is that I just don't really know anybody who has read this book. So if you have read Filthy Beasts by Kirkland Hamill, let me know what you thought of it, and if you think it would be worth holding on to in the hope that I might get around to it someday. Because right now I'm kind of thinking I'll keep it, but it's sort of on the bubble, and we'll see how that develops in time. Maybe when we do a book haul revisit next year, things will be a little bit different. And then we have Luster by Raven Leilani, which was a very big book in 2020. It feels like it's quieted down a lot. And I did read it. I liked it. I did think there were aspects of the narrative that didn't quite make sense. So I thought it was a flawed book, but I did really like it overall. Ultimately, I thought about it and decided, I'm not going to revisit this book. I don't know that I liked it enough to give it a permanent home in my library. So sort of like Damnation Spring, I decided to let it go. And I believe that was actually before we expanded my library to what you see now. So if it were still in my library today, I would be holding on to it. It would be much more in the sort of night crawling space if it was still here, where it'd be like, well, I don't know that I'm going to keep it forever, but it's going to stay for now. But at the time when things were a lot more cramped and I didn't have that much space, it didn't make sense to hold on to a book that I didn't love enough and probably would never revisit. So for that reason, it is gone. Then there's an author that I can't believe I still haven't read, Akwaeke Emeze. And the book that I would start with is actually the one that I have. It's The Death of Vivek Oji. Someday I'll get to this book. I don't quite know how. This is an author who has still eluded me. Someday I will get around to this book. I do think I'm much more likely to listen to this on audio, but I'm happy holding on to the book itself. The final book I brought into my library in August of 2020 was Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart, another book that I did end up reading and which turned out to be one of my favorite reads of 2020. 2020 was a stacked year for my favorites because that was the year Hamnet came out, and I read it and loved it, although it didn't qualify for our book haul revisit purposes. I really loved The Yield. I really loved Shuggie Bain. I had read a Toni Morrison book. It was just a stacked year, and Shuggie Bain was very much in the mix for that. I had purchased it I believe at this point it had been longlisted for the Booker Prize, and that is what put this book on the map for me. It's what sparked my interest in reading it, and I just really profoundly loved it. It, of course, went on to win the Booker Prize, and it was a finalist for the National Book Award, and it's just a really tremendous book. I was much more iffy on Douglas Stewart's follow-up, which was Young Mungo, but Shuggie Bain is a book that permanently lives in my heart. So you can imagine it's not going to be going anywhere. It's going to stay in my library and in my heart for a very, very, very long time. All right, so in August of 2020, I brought 7 books into my library, and I've read 3 of them, which, according to Google, is a 43% success rate. I'm, always hoping to hit 50% at a minimum. We're just under there, so maybe I will eventually get there. There's a bit of a question mark because, 3 out of the 7 books have been unhauled, which is 29%. So right off the bat, Nervous Conditions, This Mournable Body are not going to happen. But there's a chance I'll get 2 Filthy Beasts. And again, let me know if you've read it in the comment section down below. And then at some point, I would really like to read The Death of Vivicoji. And either one of those books would probably put me in the realm of being like 50%. So hopefully once I do those, I'll be hitting the target that I want to be at with my book haul revisits, especially when we're 4 years out from them as we are from August of 2020. Let's get to the final book haul revisit for August. We go back to August of 2019. Now, I have found usually when we go back in time, the book hauls get larger as we go further back, because 2019 was my first full year on BookTube, and I was really excited about a lot of things, and I purchased a lot of things, and this ends up happening. So it's always interesting to see what happens there. That's not always the case. Sometimes I have recent book hauls that were really large. Usually when they're large, we end up whittling a lot of things out because it's for my Pulitzer Project, or it's Toni Morrison or Louise Erdrich or something like that. But this is a large book haul on its own. And we're going to start with the book that I referenced earlier because it had been longlisted for the Booker Prize and I really wanted a copy, so I ordered it from the UK, Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, and I loved it. I believe it was on my favorite reads of 2019. It famously went on to co-win the Booker Prize that year. Actually, I think I ended up reading it in 2020, and I did love it, but 2020 was that stacked year, as we already talked about. So this was the book that made me so enthusiastic because it had been put onto my radar because of the Booker Prize, and I ordered it immediately and ended up loving it, that when I saw This Mournable Body, I sort of went all in. And then because I had not such great success with This Mournable Body, in that I've never read it, and it doesn't even live in my library anymore, my expectations for the Booker longlist have been tempered ever since. But this is the book that really made me think that it was a hot commodity for me, because I read it and I did really love it. Then I'm going to lump these 3 books together because in 2019, I discovered the Little Sisters Classics, which is a series done by Arsenal Pulp Press. Basically, they identified queer classic books that were in danger of being forgotten or that had been out of print for a long time and put them back in print with fun supplemental material and all of that stuff. And across a couple of months, I ordered a handful of them. And there were 3 that I brought into my library in August of 2019. I haven't read any of them, but they are not going anywhere. First, because I think they're really cool objects in and of themselves, like little time capsules, but also because I would really like to get around to reading them at some point. I think the one I'm most likely to read is Blackbird by Larry Duplichan, but the ones I got were Song of the Loon by Richard Amory, Blackbird by Larry Duplichan, and Patience and Sarah by Isabel Miller. And since I'm holding Patience and Sarah, I'll use that one as an example for some of the supplemental material. And here in the table of contents, you see that it has an essay called Patience and Sarah Come to Live. It has early manuscript pages, a cover, correspondence, another article called Frontiers Women in Love, opera materials, and an obituary for Alma Ratsong. So let's see if I can find some of the scans for early manuscript pages. Oh, there are letters as well. So really fun books. They will not be going anywhere in my library, but as of right now, I have not read any of them, but I would still really like to. Then there's a book that I feel so shamed that I haven't read anything by him yet, Becoming a Man by Paul Monette. I feel like he's perennially on my list of my pile of possibilities for June, because in June I read Pride books. Someday I will read a Paul Monette book. And I feel like this is sort of in the Tin Man house, where so many people have told me that I will love Paul Monette that it feels like there's a built-in sense of pressure, because what if I read him and I don't like him? But I would really like to get around to reading Paul Monette. It feels like I just need to rip the Band-Aid off at some point. Paul Monette, Edmund White, there are a couple of authors that I really just need to get to, and he's one of them. So someday this is going to happen. It's not going anywhere until it does. And even then, it will probably live in my library anyway. Now, I did haul a copy of Little Women by Louisa May Alcott in August of 2019 because I was planning to read it. That was the year that Greta Gerwig's Little Women came out, and I did a buddy read. I'm forgetting with who, but I did do a buddy read of it. Now, this is not the copy that I hauled. It turns out most copies of Little Women that you find include both parts of the story. Basically, Little Women was published in two parts. There's part 1 and part 2. Part 2 was actually released maybe a year or two later. I can't remember exactly when, but most books publish them together. The original edition that I hauled did not. So I had to get a different copy, and the one that was missing half of the story is no longer in my library. This was kind of fun, though, because when I was reading it and carrying it around, people kept telling me, oh, that's such a beautiful Bible. And it is not a Bible. It is Little Women. It's a Bible to some people, I guess. But I have read this, and it's an adorable book. It will not be going anywhere. It's going to be kind of living in my library in perpetuity. I got a copy of Away in the World by V.S. Naipaul just because it was in the sale section of my local used bookstore, so I got it really cheap. And V.S. Naipaul is a Nobel laureate, and for that reason, I had been thinking I should really read him. And I don't know what happened. 2019, my first year in BookTube, enthusiasm got the better of me, and I saw it in the sale section, and I thought that would be a fun book to have. I don't think I'm ever going to get around to reading this, and right now I'm not crunched for space, but I don't want to use the word mistakes, but I feel like enthusiasm got the better of me is a much better explanation for how this ended up in my library, because if I were going to read a V.S. Naipaul book right now, this is not the one I would go with. So will I ever get around to it? I don't know. Probably not. And for that reason, if I'm ever having a time crunch, I can kind of see like this is right around the area where it is, and Half a Life is right there. That's the one I would probably pick up. So I don't know that this is ever going to happen. And if this continues to sit, if I end up crunched for space right around here, it's probably going to end up going. But for now, it's okay staying here. Then we have Breath, Eyes, Memory by Edwidge Danticat, and this is another book that I have really been wanting to read but have not gotten around to yet. It's probably going to stick around until I do. And then we have The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. I read The Age of Innocence before I had a BookTube channel, somewhere around 2017, and loved it and have wanted to read one ever since. And now, because of my Pulitzer Prize project, I feel like I might reread The Age of Innocence at some point soon, but House of Mirth is the next Edith Wharton book that I would like to read. Actually, I have read Summer, and might read some others as I work my way through, but The House of Mirth is the one I want to get to next. So I haven't read it yet, but I would still like to. And then there's Ohio by Stephen Markley. I've heard so many good things about this book and Stephen Markley's follow-up, which was called The Deluge. Well, it's not a sequel, but it's his next book after Ohio. So this is going to continue living on my shelf, and hopefully at some point I will get around to it. I do think I'm more likely to try this on audio, but we'll see how that goes. But it's not going to be going anywhere. And Dominicana by Angie Cruz is the final book of this book haul revisit. I kept it for several years. I admit the urgency had pretty well died at a certain point, and I've just consistently heard very mixed things about Dominicana. For that reason, ultimately, I got rid of it. I think it was one of the last books I got rid of before we expanded my library. So if it were still here, I probably would still be holding on to it. But when I had a smaller library that was a little more cramped, I needed space, and I thought to myself, with the mixed things I've heard, I'm not too likely to ever get to this. And if I do, I'd probably do it on audio. So for that reason, it is no longer here. So in August of 2019, I brought 11 books into my library that qualify for our purposes here, at least. And I've only read 2, which is awful. According to Google, that is an 18% success rate, well below the 50% that I want to reach for. I've only unhauled one at this point, and that's Dominicana by Angie Cruz. However, Away in the World, the V.S. Naipaul book, could be going in that direction. But I will say most of the other books are things that are library builders, things that I would like to have in my library, so I don't think they'll be going anywhere. There's only one that might be sort of on the bubble. Overall, looking at the last 5 August book hauls, I've brought 30 books into my library. I have only read 11, which according to Google is a 37% success rate. And again, I would like it to be about a 50% success rate at a minimum. So I have a little work to do on that. However, there are still a lot of books in here that I want to read and I'm hopefully going to be getting to. So by this time next year, maybe that percentage will be a little bit higher, and maybe in 2 years I'll be hitting 50%. We'll see how things go. I have unhauled 6 out of those 30 books, which is about 20%. As I was preparing this book haul revisit video, like listing out all the books and figuring out how many I had read, how many I've unhauled, and all of that, something occurred to me. Because it was tempting for me to say 6 out of 30, 20%. So I have a 20% failure rate with my last 5 August book hauls, or my 5 August book hauls that we have to look at. But that's not actually true, because some of the books that I unhauled were unhauled because I read them and either didn't like them or didn't like them enough to hold on to them. So I went back and decided there were only 4 books that were unhauled without having been read, which is a 13% success rate, or a 13% failure rate, rather, because they were books that I spent money on, brought into my library, and ultimately didn't read and just turned around and got rid of. And I feel like that's something I might pay attention to in future book haul revisits, because it's an important number to me, and I would like to keep it under 15%. So 13% is on track, and we'll see if that number fluctuates. Like maybe if I get rid of some of these books without having read them, like Away in the World, that number is going to go up. So I'm sort of perilously close to the number that I don't want to go over, but we'll see what happens. If you have feedback about any of these books, anything you'd recommend that I try to prioritize or get to, recommendations based on my interest in any of these books, let me know all of that in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.